Hi, I'm Alex Bast-Boverhoff, Managing Director of Bridgewater Home Care, and on today's episode of Building Bridges, we're joined by Amy Kerti, Director of Empatia, Dementia Specialist Coaching. And today we're deep diving into an important and often misunderstood topic of dementia. We're going to be looking at key symptoms to look out for and when's the right time to look and contact for support. So thank you for joining me, Amy.
Hi, thanks Alex.
So what is Empatia?
Empatia Specialist Dementia Coaching is a service that supports people either living with dementia, the early symptoms of dementia, or the family member at any point in the journey.
Okay, and is that directly to the families or do you do coaching for businesses and companies?
We do both actually. I use a framework which is ongoing dementia education and counselling. So it helps people to understand the symptoms, to manage the symptoms, to understand communication and behaviour. We look at how people can adapt to the changes associated with the disease and maintain their identity. And we look at transitions, not just the larger transitions, such as is it time to bring care into the home, but also the smaller transitions, such as the subtle losses that people aren't really aware of, ultimately to help people build the resilience and sustainability to manage it as long as possible. So I support people individually through counselling and coaching, but I also work with organisations who support people with dementia and their family members and provide groups that way.
Okay. And so the support you're providing to the individuals, is it directly to the individuals or is it to the families or a combination of both?
It is a combination of both, but also on an individual level. Because dementia is a family condition, it affects everyone in the family. So I support people typically with the milder symptoms of dementia. Because it's a progressive disease, there comes a time when people are no longer able to benefit from the support that they're receiving. But also the family members, like I say, they're supported all the way throughout the trajectory of the illness. But it can be that I'm supporting maybe the person with dementia and the family member supporting them, such as a son, a daughter, or a spouse. But also, like I say, it's the wider family that I support as well, so I can provide group support for them.
Okay, fantastic. And do you support people at the point of diagnosis? Do you support them at a progressive stage or do you support them when they're may potentially not even being diagnosed yet?
Absolutely, all of those things. So I support people with a diagnosis. And the reason I support people without a diagnosis is because these days it can take from 6 months to a year, sometimes 2 years to actually receive a diagnosis. And at that point, that's when families can go into crisis because they don't know what's going on. They're still waiting for diagnostic cognitive assessment, and it's really quite scary.
So you mentioned it can take months for a diagnosis. So when would you suggest to someone is the right time to think and potentially contact a GP about a diagnosis?
So any one of us can experience memory or cognitive symptoms. And if you are worried about your memory, it's important to go to the GP because you might be experiencing some of the more reversible conditions. Depression and anxiety and stress can cause memory difficulties. The menopause can cause memory difficulties and other treatable things like vitamin B12 and thiamine deficiencies. But if you're experiencing memory problems that are probably above the normal threshold, we all run upstairs and forget what we're going to get. But if you're worried about your memory and people are telling you that you've got concerning symptoms, I would suggest going to the GP. And what they'll do is a mini assessment. And if you meet a certain criteria, then you'll get referred on to the memory assessment service.
And so when you've got referred onto the memory assessment service, what is it they actually do?
I think, like we touched on earlier, the waiting times these days just to be seen for an initial consultation with them can be 6 months and in some areas up to 2 years. But what they will do is a thing called a cognitive test, and they will ask you various questions that tap into different cognitive domains, such as your visual spatial perception, your ability to remember certain things, language, planning and problem solving. The important thing to remember is that it's not a test.
Yeah.
It's nothing that you feel that you shouldn't feel that you need to beat it to get a high score, because it's literally just assessing different areas of the brain. And most of the time you'll also receive a brain scan, and that's simply to rule out any other conditions such as possible strokes that might be causing the cognitive changes.
And do you find that sometimes a barrier to someone getting a diagnosis, feeling that they are being tested or they're being judged by someone?
What I do see frequently is that it heightens people's anxiety, because from when we go to school we're being tested,
Yeah.
and it's almost in us that to be successful you need to score high on test results, and this does heighten people's anxiety, but it isn't a test, it's literally an assessment.
Yeah, well, it's true, because even now if someone says to me, you need to do a test for anything, it puts me in a position on wanting to do it, because I feel like I'm being judged by someone else, and what happens if I fail, and the outcome of that.
And also you compare it against yourself. Your self-esteem is measured by that, and if your self-esteem's affected, you probably do worse on the test as well.
Yeah, I think it's that pressure of knowing that someone's judging you or testing you, which makes you panic, and therefore sometimes not doing as best as you could have.
Absolutely, and like you pointed out, this is one of the things that does make people anxious when they go for these assessments.
Why did it start? What made you start Empatia? What was it behind your experiences, which we'll go on to a little while? What made you think, this is what I want to do?
I've worked with people living with dementia and their families for over 20 years. So, given the positions that I've held, which have been quite unique, I've had the luxury of seeing a national picture of what's going on with health and social care services for people with dementia. And since lockdown, across the country, I mean, it's variable, people have not been able to access services. Basic needs haven't been met for people with dementia and their families.
And do you feel that's because the awareness of dementia increased and people are more aware, are more open to getting tested and being aware that actually it's not just someone getting old age and forgetfulness, it's because actually the awareness and the diagnosis has increased, but the support levels, you know, for the doctors, the GPs, hasn't met that demand?
It's a really interesting point. I think the awareness is there, but services have rescinded terribly since the lockdown. NHS England set a diagnosis target rate of 66.7%. That was the target rate we were meant to meet nationally as a country. Yeah. But 66.7% is just above half, and we weren't reaching that. So I don't think more people are getting diagnosed.
Yeah.
I just think that a backlog started in lockdown, and for some reason services haven't been able to pick themselves up for whatever reason.
And so you mentioned about your various roles. So what got you started? Everybody sort of has a passion for something, and clearly you've got a passion for this. So what is it? At what age did you suddenly think the brain fascinates me?
Well, there's two separate questions there actually. When it comes to the brain, I developed a love for the brain when I studied psychology many years ago. I think it's fascinating, and in relation to dementia, just to give you an example of why I love it so much, 86 billion neurons make up this brain. It's a series of electrical circuits, and we learn about the brain when it goes wrong. There's quite a famous example of a gentleman. His name was Phineas Gage in the early 1800s. He was a construction worker and had an accident in which a steel pole penetrated his left temporal lobe.
Okay.
Yeah, but he was lucky enough to live. But this gentleman was mild-mannered. He was kind and polite before the accident. But then after the accident, he was impulsive, he was disinhibited. People around him said they didn't recognise him anymore. As a result from that, we learned that the frontal lobe, particularly the left frontal lobe, is responsible for managing behaviour, regulating behaviour, impulsivity. And you do get a type of dementia called frontotemporal dementia. When there's more disease to that side and that part of the brain, this is where we see people presenting with similar disinhibited, impulsive behaviour and stark behaviour changes. So the brain I find fascinating, particularly in relation to dementia. But the reason I got into this what I now call a vocation was purely by accident. I was studying at a university once I qualified as a nurse many years ago. I got a job in a care home and just fell in love with people living with dementia and their family carers. It wasn't part of the plan.
Yeah.
But yeah, somehow it took off, and ever since I've dedicated 20 years, 9 years of higher education to trying to make a difference to people with dementia.
Oh, that's really impressive, and thank you for that. So you mentioned about the different types of dementia. So just in basic words, what is dementia? As basic as you can get it, because I know it's not a simple yes or no question.
It's not that. So essentially, dementia is a syndrome, and a syndrome is a collection of symptoms. It could be anything. Autism would be one. It's a collection of symptoms that tend to co-occur together. In the case of dementia, these symptoms are cognitive. I'll explain what that means in a minute. But they're cognitive because the disease affects different parts of the brain. Depending on which part of the brain is affected, this is where we see problems. Alzheimer's disease is one of those causes of dementia. And I say cause because Alzheimer's disease and the word dementia are often used interchangeably. But actually, Alzheimer's disease causes dementia, as do many other different diseases. And dementia is when the disease progresses and more cognitive functions are affected. When I say progress, I mean different areas of the brain that it covers. And the cognitive symptoms are things like our attention, memory, problem solving, language, visual spatial awareness. And it's the disease affecting these certain parts of the brain.
Okay, and you mentioned Alzheimer's being a disease which causes dementia. You hear a lot of other names and terms, Lewy body and everything else. Is that just a similar disease which causes dementia, or is it different?
They're different diseases. The causes of dementia are defined by where they start in the brain and the underlying dysfunctional protein.
Okay.
So with Alzheimer's disease, it's defined by two dysfunctional proteins, tau and amyloid. Well, you mentioned dementia with Lewy bodies. The underlying proteins that shouldn't be there are called Lewy bodies.
Oh, okay.
And there's over 50 causes of dementia, again defined by these different proteins and different parts of the brain in which it starts. To give you an example, so for Alzheimer's disease can start in different areas of the brain. The one we see most, typically see in older people. It starts around here and it causes memory difficulties.
Yeah.
But then there's much rarer types of Alzheimer's disease that aren't known as Alzheimer's disease. So we've got posterior cortical atrophy that Terry Pratchett, the author, lived with. and that affects the visual part of the brain. So people, their visual world might flip upside down.
Yeah.
And then that also progresses. We've got another condition with the same Alzheimer's disease pathology called logopenic aphasia, which affects the language. But then there's other diseases as well, like I said, that are defined by different proteins. A bit confusing?
It is, but it all makes sense. But I suppose the hard thing is for someone or a family member is to then know if it's potentially the start of dementia, because it could be a series of different effects or issues that a family member may be having. So what are the key ones that someone could look out for to potentially think, is this the start of dementia? Maybe I need to book that GP appointment. What 3 or 4 key things that someone should look for?
It is really complicated because, like I said earlier, there's many things that can cause memory difficulties, but memory difficulties are not the only defining characteristic that might imply someone has dementia, but it's the most common. So if you notice your loved one repeating themselves more than usual, not the odd repetition, but I guess a very unnatural repetition, or people are probably getting lost. You hear of people, everything seems to be fine, but they don't come home for hours because they managed to get lost. Keeping an eye on things like that. So unnatural memory loss is one of the reasons go to contact your GP.
Yeah.
But then I was talking just now about different forms of Alzheimer's disease, but also different presentations. So people associate memory problems with dementia, but actually there's many other ways in which it can manifest. So in some cases, somebody might become more withdrawn, less empathetic, and only the family member might notice this. To other people it might not be obvious. Language can change. People probably struggle to produce certain words, or their sentence structure's disordered. Again, there might be problems in their visual world, but these are all much rarer than the typical memory symptoms that we see. What I will say is young people do develop dementia, and we're more likely to see those rarer types of dementia or those rarer symptoms in younger people, because there are around 72,800 young people living with dementia in the UK.
So the support that you offer, why do you feel the advice, the support is valuable to someone? What is it that you can do and the support that you provide, what they may not be able to get elsewhere?
Again, I think that's a multifaceted question, but the aim of my service is to help people build resilience to sustain their situation for as long as possible, because people want to stay at home in the community. So I help people develop the skills to sustain their situation for as long as possible in the context of a changing healthcare arena. And it's not just helping them to develop the practical skills. I'm talking about people with the condition and the family member. It's about working through some of the complicated emotions that are dementia specific. So family members often experience a lot of guilt, which is an unnecessary emotion, and it can really hold them back. And there is also the experience of complicated grief and loss that can have an impact on their daily lives, and it's about supporting the family members to get a balance. And the reason this is different to other services is because it is empowering, it is quite skilled, and I do use advanced counselling and psychological approaches specific to the experience of living with dementia.
No, and I think it's probably the same as what we experience when we initially engage with a client or a family member looking for support. Everybody's a little bit reserved, they're not sure what they want or what they're looking for. And I think once you have that initial conversation with someone, you can see that gets lifted off because I think a lot of people hold it in and don't speak about it, especially
Yeah,
the full-time family carer. They feel like it's their responsibility. They
yeah,
don't have anybody to speak to. They don't feel like anybody's going to understand them,
yeah.
so they bottle it in.
Absolutely, and a lot of the time the family members are running on empty because they're exhausted, and you can't see the wood for the trees because you're doing it every day, and like you said, there's often no respite for people.
So as someone who's just been diagnosed with dementia,
Mm-hmm.
what should they expect, or what questions should they ask?
I think firstly it's really important to acknowledge that just because you've got a diagnosis of dementia, it's not the end of the road. It's certainly not the end of your life. There's a real stigma in our society that disempowers people. That indicates that people aren't able to do anything because they're living with dementia, which is absolutely not true. I've supported people to go travelling, to spend time more with their family, to change careers, to stay in their careers. You must remember that you can still have a life with dementia. But instead of fighting the changes, because none of us want to experience a change in our skill set and abilities, instead of fighting that, that takes a lot of energy. So it's really important for people to adapt to the changes where they can.
Okay. And I've just had my diagnosis. What sort of questions would you say to someone they should ask? A lot of people don't forethink that I'm going to get dementia, so I'm going to look into it, what's available. You know, if you were speaking to someone who's just giving you the diagnosis, is there a few questions which you would say were important to be asking?
In terms of questions, I think firstly it's really important to understand the condition that you're living with by looking into reputable sources and not going all over the internet,
Yeah.
because the internet is very good at pretending to people that there's cures and treatments out there when there's not. I think, well, what's really important is long-term planning.
Yeah.
Plan now. Find out what you need to do now to plan for the future, because you have control over this. Throughout this condition, you can manage it, even if you're too poorly to advocate later on. Sort out power of attorney. Now, just because you're enabling someone to have power of attorney over your property and affairs, which essentially is managing your money,
Yeah.
doesn't mean that you're handing it over straight away. That only happens either when you say so or when you become too poorly to make those decisions for yourself. Organise for someone you care and trust to have power of attorney over your health and welfare. Now, some of the more difficult conversations, which should be had early but are probably really difficult for people to consider, are things such as advanced care planning.
Yeah.
Thinking about what support you would like at the end of your life. What things do you want in place? Who do you want there? Think about what you want, because you can have control over this all the way through, but you need to get it written down. Speak to healthcare professionals about advanced care planning. And then there's also things such as a life story work or a life storybook. They're quite a nice activity that you can do with family, but they're also really important to communicate your needs, your likes, your interests, and you as a person, for in case you ever need care or in case you ever move into care.
And this life story book, is it something I create, or is it something you can go purchase?
Well, you can create your own. People do them with photographs. People have little stories. I've seen that you can get photograph displays where different snapshots of people's lives come onto screen, but also you can get them online. You don't have to pay. You can get them through various services and charities such as Age UK, but you can find online templates as well.
Okay. So it must be quite overwhelming to receive that diagnosis as the individual receiving it. But as a family carer or a family member, what can I expect to feel?
It's difficult for both of you. You're both going through an experience of loss and grief, but in different ways. Now, for the person with dementia, obviously they're losing skills and there's so many fears that they're facing of what's going to happen in the future. But for the family member, people do experience grief, a complex grief called anticipatory grief, where you're grieving for someone who's very much present,
Yeah.
but less accessible than they once were. And with this complicated form of grief, you can experience a lot of guilt because you want to protect that person. You feel you're not doing enough for that person. Whereas in actual fact, you're going above and beyond what you ever have before for that person. And guilt is a very prevalent emotion for many people supporting someone with dementia, but it's also a pointless emotion too. And I just want to say as well, for anyone in the supportive role or the family carer role, I like to say someone supporting a loved one with dementia, because most people upon diagnosis don't feel like they're a carer at all, because they're not. It's really important that we try to facilitate someone's independence, and it's really easy to jump in and want to protect someone you love, because we all do that. But it's really important that you're facilitating them to hold conversations, not swooping in to save them in conversation, because that can become quite disempowering. But it is also important to remember as well that the emotions that you're experiencing are very real. It's important not to suppress the anger, the frustration. It's okay to experience it. Don't feel guilty for feeling angry, because ultimately this is part of the grieving process.
No, I agree. And there's been a few times where we're supporting clients and their family members, and they do say it feels like I've lost my husband or wife, but they're still here, and it feels like I'm grieving for the person that once was here, and I don't have them anymore.
That is such a unique, difficult place to be. And people often grieve for things that they'd planned to do with that person, which is also very difficult for people to overcome. But it is a process.
So Amy, what do you find your biggest challenges?
Currently my biggest challenge is time and not being ubiquitous. Making people aware of the service, because I'm spread around in parts of the UK with this Leicestershire, Northamptonshire region as a central point. Time and, like I say, making people aware of this. But in addition, in terms of a wider economic challenge, is the complexities within healthcare services now. If people cannot get a diagnosis or can't get the support they need, sometimes that overriding need can shadow the work that I'm doing with them.
Okay, fine. And you said obviously you're based in the sort of Leicestershire, Northamptonshire area, but you do cover national then. And if someone was outside of that, you were able to support them.
I do. I see people face to face in this region, the Leicestershire, Northamptonshire region, and parts of Cambridgeshire. But beyond that, it's online support, or I visit certain organisations and provide group support through their organisation for either groups of people with the condition or family members.
And what would you say is the most rewarding part about your role?
I love working with people with dementia and their families. I absolutely love it. I love it when I can support people with dementia to realise that they're not as restricted by the condition as they think, that a lot of it is the anxiety, and once we work through that anxiety they can go on to do really good things, like I said, to stay in work, to adapt to a job that's more suitable for them now, to bring them together, ultimately to help them to realise that dementia is not the end of the road. But I think the loveliest parts of my job, and I think this is what kept me in this job for so many years, when you're working with people living with dementia and their families, I see so much compassion. I learn from every single family that I work with.
Yeah.
I learn something about life, and the extent of compassion and care and the length they go to protect someone is, honestly, in the world that we live in now, where things are so complicated and so negative, just to see that, it gives me such faith in humanity.
No, I agree, and it's similar in our role that you see everybody wrap around not just our client but the families, and you can see the difference which is made not just by ourselves supporting them but their friends, their family,
Yeah.
everybody else, and that if everybody works together,
Yeah.
you know, you can really enhance someone's life.
You've touched on a really important point there. That social support network is one of the most important things for any family, any person living with dementia to have. It's really important that they have that. Like you say, you do see people come together and they're stronger as a result.
And what keeps you going? Because you obviously run the business, you're supporting people, you're doing your day-to-day life, and you know, everyone's human, things can get on top of you. So what is it that keeps you going on a day-to-day basis to keep doing what you're doing?
It is that contact with people with dementia and their families, because like you say, everything else can be challenging, but just to know that you've helped someone, just to know that you've helped a family member, to see them regain a balance in their life and start doing things again that are important to them, to go back to being them instead of the carer, that's really important to me. And also to see people with dementia, like I say, to know that they are still being independent. They're actually the things that keep me going.
What are your plans for the next 12 months?
For the next 12 months, I'm planning to bring a lot of the work closer to home. So like I said to you, I've been working nationally, but I want to focus more on this region, particularly in terms of my time. It's hard to spread out so far. So I want to work with local services, provide the structured group support through organisations in this region, raise awareness of the service so I can provide that one-to-one support for people in their homes, because I can't provide that face-to-face support beyond a certain boundary, because it's too far for me to travel. And I find that one-to-one face-to-face support is so much more effective. And also to continue working with the really supportive and good dementia services in this region, such as yourself, Musical Memory Box, Vassal. There's so many good services around here that I think together we could all make a real impact on changing the way dementia is looked at in this region.
No, I completely agree, and I think especially in and around Harbour specifically,
Yeah.
there are so many opportunities and groups available for people with dementia, or support for the carers, which I don't think is widely available elsewhere.
No, this is quite a unique island, this area.
Thank you for joining us on today's episode of Building Bridges, where we looked at the importance of early recognition and support for dementia. And thank you, Amy, for joining us.
Thank you.
And we hope that you'll join us on the next episode of Building Bridges.